Okay, we are live. So, for those listening at home, welcome to the Live from the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will be your friendly dungeon user this morning. At the time of recording, it is Sunday morning. It's about 2 days after I have converted or ran the first session for our ongoing Friday sessions playing the Scales of War campaign or adventure path, I should say, where we had switched over from using 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons to using Robert Schwab's very cool Shadow of the Demon Lord game, which is sitting stacked right here, fresh from my campaign prep. So I had mentioned earlier this week, and I had mentioned after our most recent session that I wanted to post a kind of a campaign journal post or video about some of the interesting conversations that I've seen on Twitter and on the Google Plus communities that I'm part of about incentive structure in campaigns. And a conversation I had with some of my players earlier this week, and actually with a couple of groups of players earlier this week, that led to my decision to change our campaign from playing 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons to playing Shadow of the Demon Lord. So the way that I thought I would organize this, because it's going to be it may be a bit rambling. My videos tend to be a bit rambling, so to try to structure that a little bit, I thought I would share what if you haven't seen it before, what the sort of chatter was over the last couple of weeks about this incentive structure stuff. Some of the observations that were made about other games that were corollary conversations to that particular conversation, and then talk about how those played into my decision to make this pretty substantial change to an already going campaign. And I think that there's some, for myself at least, there's some really positive lessons that I've learned from going through this process. In particular, the kind of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater idea of being able to tool with an ongoing campaign rather than to tear it down and have to rebuild something. So first, let's start with the discussion. So the discussion was a Twitter chain or a thread on Twitter that was talking about how in pre-3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons games, your characters got experience points for bringing gold back. The primary source of your character's advancement and XP and whatnot was getting loot and bringing that back. You still got XP from killing things as well too, as every monster had an XP value. But when you compare that to the loot that you were most often getting, the primary source of your advancement was gold. So the thought being is that assuming that players were paying attention to the things that would get them up to the next level, that would let them advance, then their primary goal would be to get the loot and get the hell out. And that might mean killing everything in sight and then grabbing whatever you can from their corpses or their lairs or their homes or whatever. But it wasn't necessary to do that. If you could find some clever way to sort of trick the dragon or the hydra or the orc king or whatever, and got their loot and got out of there, you got the same substantial benefit you would get, less the relatively minor amount you would get for actually killing the things. Another way that was sort of reinforced with those earlier versions of Dungeons and Dragons too is that there were no assumptions made about parity encounters necessarily. In the thread, they mentioned that there was an encounter in one of the it's the Drow camp. It's the ones that came after the Giant series. It's the Queen of the Demon Web Pits, I think. There's one encounter that has something like 99 shadows in it, which obviously like no player group would be able to successfully take on unless they're really high level. But anyway, the point being is that because the mechanics were fairly punishing, like your characters were more prone towards death, and the encounters weren't necessarily set up to be, this is something that a X level party can handle. That combat could be fairly unpredictable, so there's a double incentive to just get the gold and get out of there. By contrast, the rationale in the thread was that from 3rd edition onwards, you've incentivized killing. So the way that you get what you need to be able to go up in a level to get your XP and go to the next level is to kill everything, is to everything that dies or that is defeated, you get XP. Now that's obviously a gross, simplification of I think what actually is happening, in particular in like fourth edition to a degree, and certainly in fifth edition. Fifth edition has really tried to encourage DMs to be giving XP for things other than the just killing things. Fifth edition, particularly, makes a point of talking about the three different pillars of D&D play, of exploration, role playing, and combat. And in that way, that they do give you ideas as to how to balance out the XP rewards for that. But I guess the other related thing that came from that is a third way of sort of playing any of these games, which is to use the milestone approach. And I honestly don't know if this is something that people have sort of done in a lot of ways. But the first time I saw that actually formalized as like this is the way that you play is from the Pathfinder game. Pathfinder referred to the milestone approach, and a lot of the adventure paths that they publish, they all have sort of rough guidelines for how you can run the thing as a milestone. And the comment that was made with that is that if you run a milestone game, then unless you've clearly communicated when the characters are going up, at the, say like they're going to go up at the end of this story, then the players don't know when that's going to happen. If you say, all right, when you finish this adventure, you're going to hit level 3 or 5 or whatever it is, then players know we need to finish this adventure so we can get to the next level. And then when we hit there, we will go up one more level. But the problem I found in my campaign, and why this I found to be pertinent, is that I tend to run a, stop and smell the roses type campaign. If the players get distracted by something and want to, do something different, I'm not fussed with that. I'd rather run with that and see what happens in the game and have fun with that. That bumps up against the expectations of the players, or the incentive structure, I guess, of the players, when they don't know how much of that stuff they need to go through before they can go up. When I have run other games that have a different experience point structure, or different advancement structure, where you're just tossing XP at people, or you're tossing advancements at people, or whatever, like the Iron Kingdoms game works that way. You just keep feeding XP, and characters slowly keep getting little things, and usually they're getting something new every 2 sessions, sometimes every session. Savage Worlds plays that way as well. But with a level-based game, you can't really do that. There are some interesting rules that I've used in the past, and 13th Age, which is a game published. Actually, I can't remember who publishes 13th Age. It is. Oh gosh, sorry, sitting right here. I think it's Pelgrane. Yeah, Pelgrane Press publishes 13th Age. Is kind of like a riff on 4th edition D&D. It uses this. It's actually baked into the rules where you get steps of advancement. So even though you may not be going up to the next level, at the end of an adventure, you at least know when you're getting some new thing, some new way to mechanically change your character. So again, like in that one, it's a little looser. The trouble is there's certain other versions of D&D, like 5th edition and 4th edition D&D, doesn't lend itself towards that. It's hard to break out the components of what you get when you level up. It's not as hard in Pathfinder, but because of that, what that means is that really the only meaningful character advancement or mechanical advancement that you can offer characters as a payoff, and to incentivize their actions towards achieving that incentive, is through giving them a new level. And that's problematic because I have found in the past that with level-based games, if I'm feeding levels out too often, then the characters outpace the scope of the game I was trying to run. I'll talk about that a little later, because I don't want to get too sidetracked, but that's the reason why I found that conversation interesting. It was neat to think about, well, what is the thing that I'm dangling, in front of my players? And because I DM so much more often than I play, I think that I forget sometimes that what it's like to see it from the player perspective, and trying to guess, okay, when do I get to do, get my next level, my next, feat, my next whatever. One of the corollary conversations that came from that was talking about a game called Ars Magica. And Ars Magica is here. It's this really interesting game. It's now published by Atlas Games, but it's been published by Wizards of the Coast and by White Wolf in the past. It's a neat game where you play as a covenant of wizards and their companions in the medieval age, in like the early 13th century. And the sort of selling point for the game is that the mages are like crazy, crazy powerful. They're very, very, it's very versatile. They've got great, power, but they're not really good at anything else. So they rely really heavily on the companions. And when you play in that campaign, every person, including generally the storyteller, will create a mage and a companion. And then in each adventure takes place in one of the seasons of play. So you would, you have a adventure in the summertime, and then one person would play their mage, and then everyone else would play their companions, and then one person would obviously be the storyteller who's running the adventure. And I've loved this game, or let me rephrase that. I've loved the idea of the game since I first got the third edition of it way back like 20, 25 years ago. And but I've always had a hard time like grokking what the game is about. Like what do I actually do in this? I get that wizards are powerful. I get that we're playing in the medieval time, but what else? Like it just, the broader picture of the game just escaped me. I mean, I'm a dummy, or just wasn't paying close enough attention. But one of the things I mentioned in this thread from last week was that the true shared character in that campaign is the Covenant, is the actual group, the place where the all the characters live. Be that an abandoned keep, or like a castle in the clouds, or something under a lake, or whatever. Like whatever crazy thing that you have, that is the shared resource, or shared character, and then it's what incentivizes all the play. And the reason is because through adventure, mages can get some experience and some of the stuff they need, the experience points they need to be able to, raise their skills and learn new magic and research things, and learn new magic. But a lot of the things that they really require, or they really need to do to really advance their powers, like researching new spells, or developing, magical items, or creating longevity potions so they can, spend more time alive and studying and mastering their art. All that stuff happens at the Covenant, and you advance significantly faster at the Covenant than you do when you're wasting time on adventures. But there are resources that you need for the Covenant, like books to study magic, or sources of magical components, which are called V in the game, or dealing with external problems like political pressures, or like religious uprisings, or whatever. All those things are basically the things you need to do, which drive your adventures. So you sort of can set up the campaign, and this is the way it's always been suggested in the rule book. You pick a place in somewhere in medieval Europe, and you plunk them down, and then you sort of fill out an idea of what's around there, and then you just let the players go. And I just did, for whatever reason, did not pay attention to that and kept thinking differently about it. But that's one of the things they pointed out in this thread, was that, no, that's what the whole thing's about. Because the best way to get your mages more powerful is to buff up the Covenant. Well, then that's why you're going on your adventures. That's why you're going to negotiate with the fairy court to try and get access to some of those magical resources. Or that's why you're traveling across, from one country to another country. Not really countries in the medieval age, but from one, region to another region, to obtain or to borrow books, or to copy books from a rival Covenant. But while you're staying there, you're going to have to do something for them to be able to be chewing up the space and resources that they might need. So it's cool. So I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, and that got me thinking of our Traveler campaign that we're playing right now, where it's really clear, like my players in my Traveler campaign are the ones who are driving the action in that. They're the ones who, like, the long-term goal for what they want to do with their characters and their ship and whatever, that's clearly set out for them, because they need to make money to pay for their crew. They need to make money to pay for the ship to keep it, flying. They need to pay the mortgage on the ship. Plus, there's specific goals they want too. There's some gear they want to get. There's some, whatever. And then while they're pursuing those goals, other adventures are happening in a kind of classic sandbox sort of way. And I, thinking about those two things, and then thinking about the Traveler game, and then thinking about my 4th edition game, really made me feel bad about my 4th edition game, because I didn't feel it was firing. It wasn't doing what I was hoping that campaign would do. The final sort of corollary thread that I'll just mention that was talked about was it wasn't so much about the incentive structure, but it was talking about, what space your game is played in. And that was talking about the Call of Cthulhu game. And Call of Cthulhu is the oldest horror role-playing game. This is the most recent edition. I think it's the 7th edition, 6th or 7th, I think. Anyway, the Call of Cthulhu is, for those unfamiliar, is a game where it basically is a horror role-playing game set in the worlds that were envisioned by a pulp writer from the beginning of the 19th century or 20th century named H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's stories were all about, it was cosmic horror more so than gothic horror. It was the idea that man's place is small in the otherwise vast and infinitely large and unknowable universe, and that by learning some of the truths of this infinite universe, mankind would, had only one option, which was to recoil into madness. So what your characters play are these very normal characters from different periods. You can play in the Victorian era, you can play to be honest, you can play in pretty much any era, but the default eras used to be Victorian era 20s when H.P. Lovecraft's stories were set, or modern era. But there weren't any, special abilities your characters had. You didn't have levels. You just went out and adventured. The character sheet, I'm not sure if I've got one in the Keeper's book here, but the character sheet is really, it just consists of your skills, because it's a skill-based system, and the only thing you need to really look at on your character sheet throughout play is really just to see what your rating and your skill is, and that's when you're making your task resolution. Here we go. So there's a example of what I'm talking about there. So you see, it's just your stats, your skills, weapons. Although weapons really are kind of useless in Call of Cthulhu. So the running joke throughout the editions has been like, your best skill is run. So, but the thing that was interesting about that to me was that it talked about how, because there's so little material on the character sheet, or someone, I don't want to sound like I'm saying that it's lacking something, because the game did not require a lot of special mechanics or special ways that it broke the rules. You didn't need to refer back to your character sheet all that much. What happened in the game was happening at the table. It was the communication between the players and the DM, and the players and each other, and interacting with the NPCs. It wasn't about, ooh, this is a situation I'm encountering, let me take a look at my character and figure out what thing I can use to try and deal with this or to help with this. And that's obviously like a rash overexpression of what happens when you're playing your character in any other game where you've got special abilities or whatnot. But it was neat to suggest that, this is a game that's been around for 30 years and has successfully maintained its appeal to people without having anything, without having a lot more beyond just your skills and your attributes and then what you bring to the table. So so that was neat too, because it got me thinking about some of the other games I've run where there have been more stripped down rules. So those were the three sort of threads that were, or three ideas that were sort of kicking around in my brain: is the incentive structure, the sort of shared resource that drove the adventure in Ars Magica, and then to a degree in Traveller as well, and then the how much game is necessary sort of discussion that was happening in relation to Call of Cthulhu. So at the time, what I was running on my alternate Fridays was my ongoing Scales of War campaign. So Scales of War is an adventure path that was published for 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons back, I believe the first one came out in 2008. It was about 9 years ago. And I love it. I think it's a really, the first, I shouldn't say that, the first like 6 adventures, the ones that take you to level 10, are a really fun and exciting and interesting series of adventures. The ones from level 11 up to level 30, I really can't comment on, because they get a little more, because characters are capable of so much more at those levels. It's tough, I think, to write structured adventures in terms of like the plot and whatever. So I'm not necessarily as much of a fan of those, but the first 10 levels I think are really, really cool. It's an interesting, spoilers for those listening who may want to play it, but it really plays up the Githyanki as a really great alien kind of invading threat. And it has airships in it, and it has dragons in it, and that's all great stuff. Like that's all stuff I want to see in my game. And it starts off with a very low level, sort of like neighborhood level mysteries that slowly expand out as the characters go through. They learn about more and more of the threat. So I love the story in it. I love the idea of that particular campaign. What I so what I was going to do is run it using 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and that's where we started. The trouble is well, I guess let me maybe preface by saying the thing I love about 4th edition D&D is if everybody is paying attention and is very tactically minded, the combats can be extremely interesting. They're very, they're very tactical. Your character has a lot of neat sort of different special abilities you can do to maneuver around and to move things in the battlefield and affect the battlefield, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, I enjoy that combat. The trouble is, because monsters have a similar sort of special abilities and stuff as well. The trouble is that it can feel very board gamey because it's an extremely tactical game. If you do not have a full group of players who are all on board with keeping that moving and keeping the narrative going in that, it can slog and feel just like you're playing through a board game. We had our, this is several years back, but one of our ongoing 4th edition campaigns, which was we've been playing for about a year and a half, almost 2 years, it was killed because we took a brief hiatus to play BattleTech, which is a tabletop game about giant robots. We played that for about 6 months, and then tried going back to 4th edition D&D, and we couldn't see it for it being more than a board game. One of the ways that I tried for this particular campaign to try and jazz up the game as well, and to play up more of those tiers of play that they identified in 5th edition, was to write or adapt, I should say, I didn't write them, adapted some travel rules from the Adventures in Middle-earth role-playing game that came out for 5th edition D&D through Cubicle. It was published by Cubicle 7. It's really just a reskinning of the same travel rules that they had originally published in the One Ring role-playing game. And they're great rules for that. Like, I really like them. I think they're interesting. They provide a fun little mini game for how to make travel feel like the way it does in Tolkien's books. The trouble is, the trouble I've identified over the last week, or the last couple of weeks, I should say, since I last ran 4th edition D&D, is that there were a couple of ways that either the things I was introducing to the game did not service the incentives that I had sort of set up. I wasn't paying attention to what my players actually wanted out of it, what the incentives that they were working towards, and I didn't recognize that there were aspects of the game that were on the character sheet, like the powers and stuff like that, that the players just did not really care about all that much. So I'll talk about those in greater detail here. So for the incentive, one of the things that became apparent, having talked to some of my players, is that because I wasn't awarding XP, and because I was using a milestone advancement, they didn't really know when they were going to hit level 2. We've been playing along for level 1 for quite a while, actually quite a while, because we started the campaign in September, and at the time of recording right now, it's January, so they've been first level for about 4 months, and in 4th edition, there isn't as much of a huge difference when you hit a new level, because the game keeps at parity in terms of difficulty levels and stuff like that. It's not like you're transforming into a wholly new character the way that you do in other versions of D&D or Pathfinder, or to a lesser degree Shadow of the Demon Lord, where you're getting substantially new powers that that change the slate of things that you can actually do. 4th edition is a much more gradual advancement, where it's the scale of damages and stuff like that, like how much damage you do, that goes up. It's not like the ways that you can alter the world are substantially changed as you gain levels. So I didn't see that as an issue. I thought, well, we're playing and it's fun. In 4th edition, your characters aren't as brittle at first level as they are in other editions. You don't have a minuscule amount of hit points, so you can really engage the full game at first level that you continue to experience through to 30th level. But again, the trouble is that a lot of my, or not, I should say a lot, but some of my players, that was what they were looking forward to. They were working towards the next level, and because they had already theory crafted their character out to 5, 6, 7 levels out. And I didn't realize that was something that was quite important to them. And because I thought there was other ways in game with expendable resources or new contacts or things like that, that those were enough of a payoff for the players. So that was one problem, was that the players weren't getting the reward that they wanted. And one of the reasons they weren't getting there is because I had decided to incorporate this travel thing. And what that meant was that about half of every session when they were traveling, sometimes the entire session, was spent dealing with what was happening on the road. And none of that stuff factored into when they were going to hit the next level. So what it meant was that the incentive they were working towards, it kept being postponed and kept being postponed and kept being postponed. And they didn't know from their perspective, they kept fighting these things and kept encountering these things and having these role-playing encounters. But I knew as the DM that, well, none of the stuff matters because you're not into the actual adventure yet. Whereas they thought, well, what the fuck? Like, how many more of these things do I need to encounter? How many more, goblin hordes do I need to kill before I hit level 2? This is crazy. So I realize now that, however, whatever my intention may have been to try and beef up that exploration pillar of the game, for a campaign like the type that I'm playing, where it's an adventure path that is really a plot-driven thing. It's, there's a story that's going on and their characters are playing through that. Any delays in that are occasioned by things like the travel rules that I came up with, all that stuff just delays gratification for the players, because that's not the game. The meat of the campaign is about the story. It's about the following through this plot that's going on. If I was running a more sandboxy style game where I was just letting the players go where they want and they'll encounter adventures and sort of go on their own way and whatnot, then the travel rules would be fine. But it's just it doesn't work. It confounds the what the actual campaign is about, rather than adding to it. So for that reason, I realized, like, shit, the travel rules are just not. It's not what this campaign needs. I might revisit those at some other point down the road with a different campaign, but for this particular campaign, that's a bad fit. I also realized in having watched back some of my other sessions, some players, one of the things that 4th edition does as well is it separates sort of character roles. Each character class, broadly speaking, fits into one of like 3 different roles. You're either 4 different roles. There's a defender, which is like a tank in World of Warcraft, if you're familiar with that. The person who's supposed to be, getting everyone to hit them and attack them. There's the leader, who's like the healer. So they're the ones who make sure that everyone's able to access their healing resources and keeps them, up, or mitigates damage, so that either the enemies are doing less damage or that the players are taking, or characters are taking, less damage. There's a striker who just does damage, and there is a controller who affects the battlefield. When you work those roles well in a 4th edition game, they can be really, really exciting and fun. If you know your role is tanking, and what you're doing throughout a combat encounter is trying to make sure nobody else is, that the enemies are not getting to your allies. It's great fun. But what I found is that even though we had talked about that stuff and we created characters with, satisfying each of the roles in mind, no one was paying attention to that in play. It was a gong show of people running all over, and the players who were tactically minded found it frustrating that the other players weren't doing that, and the players who weren't paying attention to their roles were finding it frustrating that the sort of the system was hitting up against the fiction, in the sense that their characters weren't doing in the game, or in the actual rules, they weren't able to manifest what they were sort of envisioning their characters doing. So what that led to is basically again, not so much the encounters, but the way that the players were interfacing with the game was not, or they were wanting to interface with the game, wasn't fitting up with or aligning with the actual rules and mechanics of the game. So that was a problem for me as well. And the structure as well too. Talking about getting back to the Ars Magica and the Traveler thing. When I think about what the players, when I talk to my players throughout the week, and I ask them, I'm like, well, what do you think your character's doing? Like, why are you doing this? What's the motivation here? We went through older campaigns, and they were able to easily identify why everyone was doing what they were doing. But for that particular campaign, they were thinking, well, I don't know. Like, I'm doing this because it's what happened in the adventure. So that told me that the players weren't engaging enough with the world and the story to make it interesting enough for them to care. They just knew that they needed to fight monsters and whatnot, but they weren't thinking about what it wasn't as immersive as I was hoping it would be. And again, part of the problem is that by using those like travel rules and allowing myself to let the characters smell the roses and talk to NPCs for a long time that don't necessarily matter, it led to a bit of a confusion on their part, because when the camera is spending so much time, like the camera in the game is spending so much time on so many different things, it's hard for them to pick out what the hell is the important part of this. So, and the final thing, I guess, this isn't just something that's endemic to the 4th edition game and to other games that have more involved combat mechanics, is that when combat takes a lot of time to get through, that means that you're spending a lot of your time and a lot of, therefore, your campaign in combat. And I love combat in a fantasy role-playing game. There's going to be combat, I think, in most cases. In particular, if you're setting up a dangerous world that the adventurers are going to go out into, they're going to be fighting things. So for that reason, there needs to be exciting and fun, combat mechanics. And the recent games I had run included like Savage Worlds and Traveler to a degree as well. That played Savage Worlds in particular is an incredibly cinematic game, and it plays very, very quickly, and it's fun, it's exciting, it's dangerous, and it's this feeling that I want to have in my combat games or in the combat encounters. So those are the problems that I was wrestling with. And on Wednesday, I really got into it with some of my players to try and think through what I wanted to do, because what I had in mind, what I had spent the 2 weeks between my previous session in about mid-January and the session from this past Friday, which was January 28th, I believe. No, today's 20th. What the fuck am I talking about? 26th. So it would have been like the first session was on the 12th of January. This one was on the 26th. Between the 12th and 26th, so those 2 weeks, I dug out almost every game I had and tried to think of a way to, okay, if I reskin these characters into this game, how would that look and how would it play, and would it capture some of the things that I want to do? And I went as far afield as pulling games like where is it? I spent about 2 hours converting characters into the Song of Ice and Fire role-playing game. Again, it's a Dungeons and Dragons game that I'm playing with, where I've got players or running that has players that play Minotaurs and Tieflings and whatnot. This game has no magic. It has no, no magic, no Inhumans, no nothing. But it does have interesting combat rules. It's got great rules that scale up from the personal level to the army level to the house level. And I thought, well, let's just, and it's got great rules for intrigue as well. So I thought, well, maybe what about that? So this was an extreme outlier, but I did pull pretty much everything else. I went through D&D 5th edition, basic D&D, the original like Beckme set, Pathfinder. What other ones did I use? Genesis, Mithras, Cypher. I even thought about Traveler, which was a terrible idea, but I felt to start with no bad ideas. Let's see what might fit. And then I eventually stumbled back onto Shadow of the Demon Lord. And one of the real problems I had with accurately reflecting the characters was to figure out what would mechanically play at the table the way it does in 4th edition. And Shadow of the Demon Lord is, if you're not familiar with the game, it is a dark horror fantasy game published by Schwab Entertainment, written by Robert Schwab, and it has the output for this game is staggering. Like the amount of really great quality material that has come out for it over the last little while. I mean, I shouldn't say the last little while, but since it's been published, is staggering. This is some of the printed stuff that's come out, and this does not include some of the PDF stuff that's come out for it. Like there's an enormous amount of material. The reason I mention that is because that means there's tons of resources to pick out for obscure character concepts. There are no tieflings in Shadow of the Demon Lord, but I can reskin Cambions. There are no minotaurs as a playable race in that, but I can reskin wargs. There are no Ardents in Shadow of the Demon Lord, but I can reskin priests to work that way. The benefit as well with Shadow of the Demon Lord was that I had two players who were very, very familiar with it. We've played it for almost 2 years now. So there was only certain people that needed to be kind of taught that lesson. Now, the way that Shadow of the Demon Lord works in terms of advancement is it's a milestone system. The game, as presented as a default game, is you play 11 adventures that take you from level 0 to level 10, and over the course of those adventures, you will try to prevent the end of the world. There's not an XP system in it. It's just that it's a baked-in milestone approach. So what that means is that I need to, if I'm going to use, if the rules worked well, then it would be a matter of figuring out a way to structure the campaign so the players know when they're going up, so it's clear. The other benefit to it's clear when they're going to be able to get the next level, get the next thing they need. Another thing that I liked about Shadow of the Demon Lord as well was that your characters tend to expand more out than up. The numbers don't get astronomical. They don't get really so high that it's difficult to imagine. Like you feel like superhumans compared to where you started. You're way more, like at level 10 you are much more powerful and much more capable, but you're not in that like demigodhood that you see in the upper ranges of like D&D or Pathfinder or something like that. So I felt confident that I could easily just be handing out levels and not worry about the characters outpacing. In terms of my players who love theory crafting as well, it is one of the most fun games to design characters for. Not only because you also get to advance levels quite quickly, but because you have just a ton of options. And the character, I have a review of Shadow of the Demon Lord on here that goes into more depth about this, but when you're creating your character, you've got so many different factors that play into that, including your selection of ancestry, which is like the species or race in other games, your novice path, your expert path, your master path. And then within those, you've got decisions to make as well, too. So there's an enormous amount of flexibility and creativity you can exercise in creating your characters in that, which I thought would speak to many of my players. As well, the game plays extremely, it's got a very simple mechanic, so it can play in a very, very narrative manner, and there is a mapless version of the rules that is in there that sort of abstracts ranges and combat, and that makes things move pretty quickly. So I thought that might address some of the problems that some of my players were feeling, where the mechanics, they were feeling overburdened by the mechanics of 4th edition to that. So I talked to my players about that on Wednesday, and we went through a lot of the stuff I talked about in the early parts of this video, and we decided that, well, I had said that, well, this is what I'm proposing, and I said, but I recognize that what I'm doing is I'm switching the game. Everyone signed up to play 4th edition. I'm swapping over to a different game. I'm not sure that's fair to my players, and at that time, I sort of talked myself out of making the switch, but between then and Friday, the actual session, I talked myself back into it. I finished the conversions, I got everything ready, and we were up and off to the races. So the long story short is that the campaign now is going to be played going forward with Shadow of the Demon Lord. All of my players, I went through at the end of the session. We played through so they would get a feel of the game. It was a dungeon run, which has always been a concern of mine. Like, I find dungeon runs in the past have been really fucking boring. Like playing in them or running them, I tend to get bored. And that I recognize as a fault of mine, because I was not presenting the environment in as exciting or dynamic as a way as I could. Watching some friends online run their dungeon crawls has really helped me get a better idea of how to capture the things that make those kinds of environments, those kinds of adventures exciting. And with Shadow of the Demon Lord, I can really play up that aspect. In particular, I mentioned that this is a horror fantasy game, and it is a horror game. Like there's rules for insanity and for corruption, and great rules for fear, and it really makes it the encountering, your players or your characters encountering the unknown or the scary or the terrifying. It makes it really mechanically real for you. And that really helped play up the atmosphere of this particular crypt, because the guys are facing both a band of hobgoblins that have allied themselves with a ancient family of necromancers. And the necromancer stuff has been great. Like, they've been appropriately terrified of these things, and slowly seeing their insanity scores tick up as they go. But as much as I'm grinning as a evil DM to do that, my players said they really enjoyed that aspect of it. So that makes me very happy, and it makes it, I think, a more lived-in world. In addition, because the combat moves a lot faster than it does in 4th edition, and also because it isn't as arch or as like gamified as in 4th edition, it feels more, I don't know, it feels less like my players who aren't as familiar with the 4th edition rules, they don't need to figure out, here's what I'm envisioning my character doing. Now I'm going to translate that into the game rules and see if I can get it to do what I want it to do, which for some of my players was a very unsatisfying experience. Shadow of the Demon Lord, it makes it easier to do that, to take their description of what they want to do, give it game mechanics, and have it have an interesting result. Also, stripping out the minions rules. I love the minion rules in a lot of different games, like in Genesis and in the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game. I didn't realize that it robs this type of game that I'm trying to run, where it's more of a dark fantasy type thing. By having minions in there, it's sort of, I don't think it plays up what I'm wanting. I want my players to fear a group of 20 hobgoblins. I don't want them to think, ha, it's going to be a couple of area attacks and we can clear these suckers out. And that's what this game supports more than what 4th did. Getting back to the things they talked about, what this means to me is that, I'll go in reverse order. The lesson I got from Call of Cthulhu from that discussion is that as much as we can focus the game in the game and minimize the amount of stuff that's on the character sheet, like in Shadow of the Demon Lord, you still have lots of interesting tactical options for your characters. Spellcasters have a slate of cool evocative spells they get to use, but more of the game and more of the focus on the players is what's actually happening in the game and how they can describe and interact with that. Players were already doing things like knocking people down or trying to move them around or grapple them or whatever, more so than I ever saw in our 4th edition games. And that's what I want, is for them to be in the fiction, focusing on that, and then still having some interesting options from their characters. So that's a lesson from Call of Cthulhu. From Ars Magica, I don't know. I still, because this is a story game, it's not going to play like what Ars Magica or what Traveller does. This is an adventure path that has a specific plot arc to it, and to try and introduce elements from a sandbox game, that will just fuck up the story. And obviously, I mean, like, the story is whatever is happening at the table, right? But for the purpose of this thing, what I'm hoping is that it's going to be, there are enough ways throughout this particular adventure path to incentivize the players, following that story along. I'm not going to be railroading them, and the adventure path, for the most part, is good for that. It really does naturally flow from one to the other and whatever. But if I add in sandbox elements, what it does is it confuses the characters. At best, it confuses the characters, or it waters down the momentum of the narrative flow. And there's a really great narrative story that's going to play throughout this campaign. So that's what I learned from the discussions about Ars Magica and about Traveller. And then for the incentive thing, that was a very helpful discussion, because it got me thinking about what the players actually want, like what they're working towards. I don't mean their characters, I mean the actual players themselves. what the players are actually getting out of that. Every role-playing game has a discussion of, your types of players that are in your game, and who plays for different reasons. And I think it is extremely important to both communicate, first understand what your players are actually wanting out of the game. What's the thing that gives them their payoff? Is it gaining levels? Is it, playing their characters? Is it, getting in lots of fights or whatever? What is it that they're actually, working towards? And more, in particular for systems that are level-based systems, there are more people, I mean, more players, at least my group there is, who are invested in seeing their characters advance, right? Seeing that hit that next level. So I'm hoping that this new game will allow them to see that payoff more often than they did before. As an aside, when I used to run the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game, I ran that for about 2 years. And the great thing about that game was that every 2 sessions, the players would get something new. So they were able to plan ahead and pick their new abilities or traits or skills or whatever, and see those realized in a reasonable time period. And I never had any concerns about balance or whatever. So level-based games are a different animal when the challenge ratings or whatnot can outpace, or cannot sync up with where the characters are supposed to be. I have had another 5th edition campaign that went off the rails because I let the characters, follow wherever they wanted to go when we were trying to follow this major plot. It was for the Horde of the Dragon Queen adventure path. And what ended up happening is that the characters all hit level 8 when the adventure itself was still at level 4. I mean, I could have reskinned that and reworked it in some way, but I found it frustrating because the characters at the pace they were going were going to be level 20 before we really, got anywhere near to completing the first adventure. So by taking a game where the leveling isn't going to transform how the characters interact with the world, like the way it does in D&D when characters hit level 5, level 5, level 11, and level 17, when they get access to dramatically different spells that can radically alter the way that they can interact with the world by teleporting or killing mass groups of people or wishing and altering reality. This game doesn't do that. There isn't that sort of tier you hit where you suddenly change that. And yeah, I think that's it. So that's what was behind, I guess, the change, and why we didn't have a video on Wednesday was because we spent most of Wednesday talking about this stuff and talking through the incentives and what's going on with the campaign and whatever. And to end on a positive note, I'm more excited about this particular campaign now than I have been for about 2 or 3 months now. The last month or last couple of weeks, I really thought that we were going to have to, shelve that campaign because I didn't think the players would want to play different versions of their characters. I was worried about certain of my players actually liking Shadow of the Demon Lord, and I didn't know. I mean, I was hopeful that it would satisfy more of these issues that I'd been thinking about over the last couple of weeks. But it really does seem to be working really well. And the added benefit is that there's other aspects of the game, like the horror aspect and the insanity and corruption rules, that the players are really excited about. That I didn't think of it as that. So there's an added benefit to it. I spent about 6 hours yesterday just reworking some stuff from for the next session, getting ready to run it, and that's a sign that my excitement and my engagement with the campaign is back up. And I mean that's always it's very important to have players obviously having fun, but the way that we achieve that as DMs is keeping our enthusiasm up. We never want this to feel like work, or a chore. And the lesson I've learned from this is to communicate to the players clearly, what we're doing in the campaign. This is the story we're following. This is the whatever. Like, we want to play through these adventures. So make characters who are going to want to, do that stuff. And as we're playing through, that's what we're doing. We're not going to be doing sandbox stuff where you're going off and doing whatever. Be live to what the players actually want out of the campaign, so you can deliver it to them in a timely fashion. but also don't be afraid to try tinkering in a substantial way with an ongoing campaign. Like, I am thrilled that we're going to continue playing through this adventure path, just using a different lens to see these, through which to view these characters and this world. It's going to provide, many more months worth of fun. It'll also get us through the story a lot faster, which I'm really excited about, because at the end of the day, I think that's what we as DMs want to do, is share these cool stories. When we're running pre-written adventures, we want to share these cool stories with our friends, and if we tell them without playing through it, it spoils the surprise. And if we play through it with them, then we get to, we can talk about all the cool stuff after it's finished. And I'm looking forward to doing that with Scales of War. So anyway, so this was a bit of a rambling and not necessarily, very focused discussion about player incentive in general. It was really more, this is what the community was talking about, and here's what I learned from that. But I hope you found this interesting and hopefully helpful for you if you're having any similar struggles with your campaign. As always, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns regarding this video, please don't hesitate to leave a comment in the section below, and I will endeavor to respond in a timely fashion. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that the weekend, at the time of the recording, it's the weekend, so I hope the weekend is treating you really well. And I will look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.